Nurses of Reddit. What were the most haunting things someone said on their deathbed? Former CNA in the dementia unit of an assisted living facility. My dad is on his way to pick me up now. She said that every time I checked on her until she died about a week after it started. While she was still mobile, she would tidy her room and sit on the edge of her bed and just wait most of the day. I didn't mean to. We were sending this middle-aged guy home after his ER visit. As soon as we moved him off the bed, he went unresponsive and had no heartbeat. We did a couple rounds of CPR, and he began to come to. He blinked a couple times and the doctor running the code jokingly said, "Sir, you almost died on us." The man said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," in a sad way. His heart then stopped again and we couldn't get him back. Since a lot of you are asking, it was most likely a saddle pulmonary embolism. He was there for something pretty mild, but he threw a clot right when he was being transferred. If you want to look it up, he had classic cape cyanosis across his chest, which is indicative of a big PE. Gosh, that's sad. Apparently when my father died of a completely unexpected heart attack, he just kept apologizing to my mother before he went unconscious. Hurts to think about people knowing they're dying and desperately not wanting to, but not getting a choice. I started my nursing career on a palliative unit. In my first 3 months as a RN, I pronounced 7 deaths. This one patient had advanced dementia and often believed he was at work while he was awake in the hospital. He would often give us, the nurses and care aides, tasks and jobs to do, as he believed himself to be our superior. One day near the end of December, he asks me when is New Year's. What day is it this year? I tell him New Year's will be the upcoming Tuesday. He nods and tells me that he thinks he's going to have to quit after the new year. This job is getting too difficult for him and he can't keep up. It's time to retire. I tell him we appreciate all the hard work he's done and we'll miss him terribly when he's gone. That he was a great employee and we all loved working with him. That Tuesday, January 1st, he passed away peacefully in his sleep at 0200. I will never forget that conversation. Edit, some misspelled words. In the weeks before my grandfather died, he told a nurse something like, "Be quick. I have a class beginning soon." He had been a teacher 40 years before. The nurse answered, "Remember, the school is closed today." My grandfather replied, "Oh, right." Short story. But we had a young patient years ago. She had a history of 4 drug use, had gotten sober a few months ago but had developed endocarditis, infection of her heart, and had vegetation on her valves as well as severe heart failure from dirty needles. She needed months of antibiotics, and then would be eligible to get a VAD, ventricular assist device, machine to bypass her heart and possibly bridge her to a transplant after being sober long enough. She had already been on the unit over a month. She was quiet, sweet, and reserved but always thankful for her care. She had no social support. Her mother was who gave her drugs the first time, and she had no contact with anyone in her life except for one friend who came in once a week to check on her. On her 24th birthday we got her a cupcake and sang her happy birthday. We hung a banner in her room, got her little presents, some games to play in the hospital and adult coloring books. She said thank you but didn't show a lot of emotion. She was always quiet and we were not entirely sure how she felt at the time. That day, on her birthday, she went into cardiac arrest and died. We spent 45 minutes trying to get her back. Her friend came in to collect her things, and showed us the message she sent her that day. It had a picture of the cupcake, presents, and banner and said, "I love my nurses. I don't know how to tell them, but they're the best family I've ever had." She did tell us in the end. I'll never forget her. I cried on and off the entire rest of my night shift. Edit, so I went to sleep between night shifts and woke up to read the comments and this blowing up. Thank you all. I'm glad it had some impact on others. This is not always an easy job. I love what I do, and I appreciate the support. Sometimes nursing is emotionally devastating, but it can be incredibly enriching as well. This event was formative for me in many ways. I still think about the impact we all have on people around us, even if they don't always have the ability to show it. Please be kind. You never know when it might make you the best part of someone's life. She looked at me and said, "You really are a little pipsqueak." I was her favorite nurse too. Being funny at the face of death is brave. My great uncle's last words before he passed were, "It is what it is." I know it's really common, but I find myself saying it quite a lot nowadays. It is what it is. My great aunt, who lived to be 101, was straight vegetative for like a month or so before passing. The day after her 101st birthday. On the day of her birthday, she suddenly was conscious and awake as everybody had come to leave a birthday cake. She told stories and laughed. Then she went back to being comatose and died the next day. Woman loved her birthday, lol. Sounds like terminal lucidity. Alzheimer's and dementia patients will often rally just before death, becoming completely aware of their surroundings and loved ones. Never heard of this. It's as if the brain by itself knows what's coming even if the person is unaware and gives it everything it's got for one last time. Looked after a guy with end-stage heart failure. He kept having episodes where if he coughed or leaned forward, anything to increase his intrathoracic pressure, he would pass out. He would come back after a few minutes and gradually go from purple back to pink. How long was I out for that time? He was fully mentally fine, sharp, witty and at peace with what was going to eventually happen to him. Him and me were joking that one of these episodes were going to kill him, as he sipped his tea and we talked rubbish. 5 minutes later it happened again and he didn't come back. He had a DNR order which was sensible. Very eerie to talk to somebody so vibrant and alert minutes before he died. Such a nice dude. I want to be in that mindset when I go too. Many moons ago when I was a nursing student, a man in his 40s was lying on his deathbed from terminal cancer, his sobbing wife lying in bed next to him. He looked at his wife, using the last bit of energy he had to gently wipe away her tears and stroke her cheek. He took off his oxygen mask and said, "Don't worry, love. Don't be afraid. It's just death," and passed shortly after. One of the short ones, but it hits so hard. This was during my final year as a medical student. Internship. It was late and we were doing our last rounds for the night. Right before the shift change, there was an elderly gentleman. Came from at-home hospice. Stage 4 cancer. COVID had limited family visits to short increments. Family often had to wait in the lobbies or go back home until another visiting time slot was opened. He held on for a few days. When we were alone, we had spoken during moments of his lucidity. He had expressed his guilt over the pain his dying was causing to his loved ones. He looked at me with a weak but genuine smile every time I asked if he was okay. He never once complained of pain. He even outright denied pain medication when offered. His reasoning was that someone else would need it and not him. We all knew he was hurting. But, on that last night, he said to me, "I want this to be my final lesson to my family. I want to show them how to die with dignity." A few moments later, he asked me if I could say to him it was okay to die, to find peace and rest. He said he couldn't bear the thought of his family seeing him die. He wanted to hold on because he was his family's whole support system. But he finally said his pain was too much. He was ready to pass. I told him that he didn't need to keep fighting for his family's comfort. If he was truly in pain and ready to go, it would be okay to die. His family would understand. Once I gave him the okay, he started the process. Delirium, heavy breathing, and fidgeting, and the death rattle. And then he was gone. He was much a great man, a kind and gentle soul. I never knew for long, but I genuinely miss the man. Rest in peace, sir. From when I worked in private practice, had a patient get diagnosed with a moderately aggressive but treatable throat cancer. We tried everything we could think of to get him to consider treatment. He refused any type of treatment. So after about 3 months, his wife had their 2 adult sons basically carry him into the office at 4:50 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. I was the only nurse in the building. I got him into an exam room. Dude was completely gray, gaunt, and you could hear how close the end was every time he breathed. It wasn't exactly a death rattle, but you just knew his lungs were full of fluid. His sons sit him in a chair and he starts to slide out. The room was too small to put him on the floor and the exam table was too high to lift him up on it. I stood between his legs and held him upright in the chair while I told the sons to go get the doctor. Told the wife to call 911. We all knew nothing was going to keep the man alive much longer. He patted the side of my legit was the most he could move and whispered, "I should have listened to you all. I don't want to die." He lost consciousness and all I could do was just keep him from sliding out of the chair until the EMTs got there. After the ambulance got him to the hospital, he lasted about 4 hours. I had a nonverbal patient overnight that was in for something pretty routine. Around 6:30 a.m. at the end of my shift I walked by his room and smiled at him. He waved to me. 1 minute later he coded and wasn't able to be revived. I'm a nursing student in Canada, and on my palliative rotation I had a patient that was getting medically assisted dying the next day. He was an elderly cancer patient. He told me he was a self-ordained minister. Nothing official, but an at-home type preacher, and that I could confess to him anything I wanted. I humored him and whispered to him some of my biggest secrets. I figured who cares, he was going to die tomorrow anyway. He told me it was alright, and I could tell he appreciated that I confided in him. He also told me his email address and said that while he would not be sending emails in return, he would be receiving them. He was a cool guy. My stepfather passed away last year. Towards the end he was very cranky and hadn't treated my mother very kindly. Before he lost consciousness he was stroking her face saying beautiful, beautiful. That made me happy. My grandpa was like this. He got serious ill, colon breach, and he couldn't remember faces. Was telling people he never gets visited. When my grandma sat right next to him. And he became generally very mean. Until the last week. We already knew he wasn't going to make it any longer, but he completely changed in his last week. Came back to his senses, told my grandma over and over again that he loves her and that she's beautiful. Told his kids that he is proud of them. Told us that we were the best grandkids in the world. And then he just went to sleep and never woke up. Writing that actually makes me cry. It has been almost 6 years, but it still hurts so much. My dad was in the hospital and found out he had lung cancer. It was him, my stepmom, and a nurse in the room. He told my stepmom to get him something just to get her to leave the room. The nurse said that before she could stop him he took off his oxygen mask. Said I'm done, and he lost consciousness immediately. He was on life support for a day or so, but he was already gone. When we pulled the plug his body died in less than 5 minutes. I guess he really was done. A couple odd and sad ones for me, but one of mine is an elderly lady who was pleasantly confused and a comfort care PT who was on the way, and I was giving her a bath one night and I asked how she was doing and she goes, "I'm a DNR. Baby, I'm doing just fine." She passed 30 minutes later at it, and I was teaching a new grad who this was her first PT like this, so it made it a little more meaningful for us. My grandmother grasped the nurse's hand and said, "I think I'm going to die now." The nurse was telling her no, she was doing much better and would likely leave soon, but my grandmother was gone before she could finish her sentence. She knew. How will I explain this mess? Pointing to his butt, second hand from a close ER nurse, lad comes in after a car accident. His work van had flipped and rolled. The fellow was wheeled and fully conscious. No pain, after EMS, or disorientation. However, he was completely twisted in half from the midsection down. There was no way he would survive untwisting, but the blood vessels must have been cinched in such a way that he didn't bleed out. The doctors and nurses explained the situation to him and suggested his family come to say goodbye. He looked like he was lounging on the couch watching TV with a blanket over his lower half. Once the realization set in, he replied with, "How will I explain this mess? I'm scared, elderly gentleman. Worsening congestive heart failure. Incapacitated, and his wife put him on hospice. He was comfort measures only." I was at the nurse's station and I could hear him starting to gasp for air. I walked into the room and he was struggling to breathe. I put my stethoscope up to his back, but I already knew what was happening. His lungs were full of fluid. I sat him up in bed and he stared at me, eyes wide open, head tilted slightly back. Facial expression was full-blown panic. "I'm scared." Immediately after he said the words, his oxygen mask started filling up with pink/red frothy foam, running down his face and dripping onto his gown. He was dead within minutes, and all I could do was watch him. I will never forget his face. Had a patient screaming out, "They're coming to get me," and calling for help. He died shortly after. I'm only 18, that shit never leaves you. She had skin cancer all over from a childhood event of her cousin pushing her into boiling water and eventually couldn't even roll over without writhing in pain. It was the worst experience of my life. I shortly left inpatient nursing after that. I sat hospice with my best friend. She had breast cancer and held it off for 8 years. At the very end, I was holding her hand for the last thing she said. "I don't want to die." She really didn't. Wish she was still here. Not an ER staff member, but a first responder. Had a guy take some shrapnel from a metal working rig. Was bleeding out from his chest. Was up walking and talking, but bleeding. Within minutes, he started gasping for air. Before he became unconscious, he said, "I need to call my mom. I'm not a nurse, but I do know my father's, possibly, last words." I wasn't there, but he called me and left me a long voicemail. It was the middle of the night, so I was passed out. It all boiled down to him apologizing for a fight we had months before, after which we didn't talk for a while. The final words I have recorded before he hung up were, and I quote, "I hope you don't blame yourself for what is going to happen, but I think this is the end for me. I'm sorry I couldn't talk to you one last time." He committed suicide within an hour of that voicemail, according to the coroner's report. I was only 17 at the time. When I woke up the next morning, it was too late to call him back. It may not be haunting to most, but it does haunt me to this day. And I still blame myself because I could tell from his voice that that fight was still weighing on him. You know what's funny? Everyone says living is the hard part. No, dying is much harder than living. Cancer patient in their 40s who was incredibly active and athletic up until their diagnosis said this to me as a student in my hospice clinical. Stuck with me ever since. I had a lady tell me in her confused state that her husband disappeared after years of domestic violence. I didn't understand what she meant. I expressed my condolences and asked where she think he went. All she said was underground. I didn't ask any more questions after that. I never did see her again. Apparently she passed shortly after. My middle school science teacher passed away during the switch from 7th to 8th grade. I forget why, but the faculty told all of us and had an anecdote about how, when she was fading away, her last words were, "I'm in a room full of peeps. Her favorite candy, everyone else hallucinating angels and dogs." My teacher looked into the afterlife and saw a mountain of marshmallows. Physical therapist here. I treated a man in his 90s who was a DNR/DNI. At least once a week when I would go to his room to start our sessions, he would cry and say I didn't want to kill the kids. After speaking to his nurse, it was revealed that he had killed children in World War II. He collapsed during a session and said, "The kids are here to get me." He died a few minutes later. Edit, he wasn't displaying fear when he verbalized this after he collapsed. He seemed at peace. I worked in a nursing home and a lot of the people who were dying saw their spouses who had passed before them. One lovely old lady said her husband was in the room, and when I told her it was okay to go with him, she said, no, I hate him. I'm scared of him." And started to cry. All I could do was hold her hand and tell her I would send him away. She passed very shortly after that with a smile on her face. I hope he wasn't there for her. I've watched 3 people die. The first was my father. He died of non-smoker's lung cancer. He hallucinated a Labrador. Then a few minutes later he tried to get out of bed and said, "Hang on." and he immediately went into cardiac arrest. 6 months later, my son died before my eyes unexpectedly at 20 months old. Not much to say about that except that he looked confused before he died. 2 years later, I watched my husband's grandmother die from cervical cancer. She kept asking what time it was. This is something I realized my father did when he passed too. She said she was ready to die but didn't know what to do. We all just sat with her and laughed and told stories. I sat with her for like 2 days straight, and the second I left the room to care for my newborn, my husband called and said she was dying. I think she wanted me to leave because she knew I had seen enough death before she went. She was an amazing woman. Edit, feel the need to share that on her deathbed Grandma Kitty still found the energy to sing the ABCs with her brand new great-granddaughter. Literally a gem of a woman. My mom told me that my grandma's last words were, "Wanna hear a joke?" And then a long beep was the only noise that filled the room. Edit, why did you give me the helpful reward?